Question 1. Which of the following best describes the historical evolution of law enforcement in South Dakota? A. South Dakota's law enforcement history primarily traces back to the early 20th century when modern policing methods were first established in the state. B. Law enforcement in South Dakota has deep roots dating back to the territorial days, with the establishment of the South Dakota Rangers in 1874 to address issues related to the influx of settlers and conflicts with Native American tribes. C. The modernization of law enforcement in South Dakota began in the late 19th century with the implementation of professional police departments in major cities like Sioux Falls and Rapid City. D. The law enforcement landscape in South Dakota saw significant changes following World War II, with the introduction of community policing initiatives and increased federal funding. Correct answer. B. Law enforcement in South Dakota has deep roots dating back to the territorial days, with the establishment of the South Dakota Rangers in 1874 to address issues related to the influx of settlers and conflicts with Native American tribes. Explanation. The correct answer is B, because South Dakota's law enforcement history indeed dates back to the territorial era. The South Dakota Rangers were formed in 1874 to maintain order during the settlement period, making significant contributions to the state's law enforcement legacy. This option reflects an understanding of the historical context specific to South Dakota, emphasizing the state's unique law enforcement challenges during its early development. Question 2. Which of the following scenarios best exemplifies ethical conduct in law enforcement, as per South Dakota's standards? Scenario. Officer Rodriguez, while on patrol, notices a group of teenagers loitering in a park after hours. Instead of immediately approaching them and issuing citations, Officer Rodriguez decides to engage with the teenagers, striking up a conversation to understand why they are there. Through respectful dialogue, Officer Rodriguez learns that the teenagers are part of a local community group organizing a cleanup event for the park the next day. Impressed by their initiative, Officer Rodriguez offers to provide them with information on obtaining the necessary permits and even volunteers to assist with their cleanup efforts. A. Approaching the teenagers sternly and issuing citations for loitering, emphasizing the importance of obeying park rules. B. Ignoring the teenagers and continuing patrol without intervening in their activities. C. Engaging in conversation with the teenagers to understand their intentions and offering assistance and guidance to support their community initiatives. D. Calling for backup and dispersing the teenagers forcefully to ensure compliance with park regulations. Correct answer. C. Engaging in conversation with the teenagers to understand their intentions and offering assistance and guidance to support their community initiatives. Explanation. Option C demonstrates ethical conduct in law enforcement by prioritizing community engagement and problem-solving over punitive measures. Officer Rodriguez's approach aligns with the principles of community-oriented policing, which emphasizes building positive relationships and addressing underlying issues contributing to crime or disorder. By taking the time to understand the teenagers' motives and offering support for their community initiative, Officer Rodriguez exemplifies proactive and empathetic policing, fostering trust and cooperation within the community. Question 3. According to South Dakota's laws and regulations, what is the primary purpose of Miranda rights during police interrogations? A. To inform suspects of the severity of their offenses and potential consequences. B. To provide suspects with legal counsel and representation during questioning. C. To ensure suspects are aware of their rights, including the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney, before being subjected to custodial interrogation. D. To intimidate suspects into confessing to crimes through the threat of legal action. Correct answer. C. To ensure suspects are aware of their rights, including the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney, before being subjected to custodial interrogation. Explanation. Option C reflects the purpose of Miranda rights as outlined by South Dakota's laws and regulations. Miranda rights, derived from the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case Miranda v. Arizona, are designed to safeguard suspects' Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and Sixth Amendment right to counsel during police interrogations. By informing suspects of their rights, including the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney, before questioning, law enforcement officers ensure that statements obtained during custodial interrogation are obtained in compliance with constitutional standards, thus preserving the integrity of the criminal justice process. Question 4. In South Dakota, what is the significance of understanding the plain view doctrine for law enforcement officers? A. It allows officers to conduct searches without warrants if they have probable cause to believe evidence is present. B. It permits officers to seize evidence that is in plain sight during a lawful observation. C. It requires officers to obtain consent from the suspect before conducting a search of their property. D. It prohibits officers from using evidence obtained through visual observation in court proceedings. Correct answer. B. It permits officers to seize evidence that is in plain sight during a lawful observation. Explanation. Option B reflects the essence of the plain view doctrine, which allows law enforcement officers to seize evidence without a warrant if it is plainly visible and discovered during a lawful observation. This legal principle applies when an officer has a lawful right to be in the location where the evidence is observed, and the incriminating nature of the evidence is immediately apparent. Understanding the plain view doctrine is crucial for officers to effectively gather evidence and maintain the integrity of criminal investigations while adhering to constitutional standards. Question 5. Which of the following actions by a law enforcement officer best demonstrates effective use of de-escalation techniques during a tense encounter? A. Raising their voice and issuing commands to assert authority over the situation. B. Employing physical force to quickly subdue the individual exhibiting aggressive behavior. C. Maintaining a calm demeanor, actively listening to the individual's concerns, and offering reassurance to reduce tension. D. Threatening the individual with severe legal consequences if they do not comply with orders. Correct answer. C. Maintaining a calm demeanor, actively listening to the individual's concerns, and offering reassurance to reduce tension. Explanation. Option C exemplifies effective de-escalation techniques by emphasizing the importance of maintaining a calm and empathetic approach during tense encounters. De-escalation involves strategies aimed at reducing the intensity of a conflict or confrontation, with the goal of resolving the situation peacefully and minimizing the need for physical force. Actively listening to the individual, acknowledging their concerns, and offering reassurance can help build rapport and diffuse hostility, fostering a conducive environment for conflict resolution without resorting to coercive measures. Question 6. Under South Dakota law, when can a law enforcement officer conduct a warrantless search of a suspect's vehicle? A. Only when the officer has obtained explicit consent from the suspect. B. If the officer believes there is probable cause to suspect the vehicle contains evidence of a crime. C. Whenever the officer deems it necessary for public safety, regardless of probable cause. D. Warrantless searches of vehicles are prohibited under all circumstances. Correct answer. B. If the officer believes there is probable cause to suspect the vehicle contains evidence of a crime. Explanation. Option B reflects the legal standard for conducting a warrantless search of a suspect's vehicle based on probable cause. In South Dakota, as in many jurisdictions, law enforcement officers may search a vehicle without a warrant if they have a reasonable belief that the vehicle contains evidence of a crime, such as contraband or weapons. Probable cause requires more than mere suspicion but does not necessitate absolute certainty. It is based on factual circumstances that would lead a reasonable person to believe that a crime has been, is being, or will be committed. Question 7. Which of the following statements accurately describes the role of a law enforcement officer in a community policing initiative? A. Law enforcement officers primarily focus on reactive responses to criminal activity, with limited engagement with community members. B. Officers act as authoritative figures, imposing strict regulations and penalties to maintain order within the community. C. Officers collaborate with community members to identify and address underlying issues contributing to crime and disorder. D. Law enforcement officers are solely responsible for enforcing laws and regulations, with little involvement in community outreach efforts. Correct answer. C. Officers collaborate with community members to identify and address underlying issues contributing to crime and disorder. Explanation. Option C highlights the collaborative nature of community policing, emphasizing the active involvement of law enforcement officers in partnership with community members to address crime and disorder. Community policing strategies prioritize building trust, fostering positive relationships, and addressing root causes of crime through problem-solving approaches. By working together with residents, businesses, and organizations, officers can tailor responses to local concerns and develop effective crime prevention strategies that reflect the community's priorities and values. Question 8. Which of the following is a key component of effective report writing for law enforcement officers in South Dakota? A. Providing subjective opinions and personal biases in the report narrative. B. Including speculative information and assumptions about the incident. C. Ensuring accuracy, objectivity, and clarity in documenting relevant facts and observations. D. Omitting details that may be deemed irrelevant to the investigation. Correct answer. C. Ensuring accuracy, objectivity, and clarity in documenting relevant facts and observations. Explanation. Option C underscores the importance of accuracy, objectivity, and clarity in report writing for law enforcement officers. Reports serve as official documentation of incidents, investigations, and interactions, and their accuracy and completeness are essential for legal and administrative purposes. Objective reporting requires officers to present factual information without subjective opinions or personal biases, maintaining professional integrity and credibility. Clarity ensures that reports are easily understood by stakeholders, including other officers, supervisors, prosecutors, and the judiciary, facilitating effective communication and decision-making within the criminal justice system. Question 9. Which South Dakota specific law pertains to the use of deadly force by law enforcement officers? A. The Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force to defend themselves in certain situations. B. The Castle Doctrine, which permits individuals to use deadly force to defend their homes or vehicles from intruders. C. The Law Enforcement Office's Bill of Rights, which outlines procedural protections for officers involved in use of force incidents. D. The Justifiable Homicide by Law Enforcement statute, which establishes guidelines for the lawful use of deadly force by officers in the line of duty. Correct answer. D. The Justifiable Homicide by Law Enforcement statute, which establishes guidelines for the lawful use of deadly force by officers in the line of duty. Explanation. Option D refers to South Dakota's specific law governing the use of deadly force by law enforcement officers. The Justifiable Homicide by Law Enforcement statute outlines circumstances under which officers are authorized to use deadly force in the performance of their duties, such as when they reasonably believe it is necessary to protect themselves or others from imminent harm or to apprehend a fleeing felon who poses a significant threat to public safety. Understanding this statute is essential for officers to make informed decisions regarding the use of force and to ensure compliance with state law and departmental policies. Question 10. In South Dakota, what is the primary purpose of the chain of custody in evidence management? A. To establish a chronological record of all individuals who have handled or had access to evidence during an investigation. B. To prevent unauthorized access to sensitive evidence by restricting its availability to designated personnel only. C. To expedite the processing of evidence by minimizing administrative delays and bureaucratic procedures. D. To ensure the physical integrity and preservation of evidence by storing it in secure and climate-controlled facilities. Correct answer. A. To establish a chronological record of all individuals who have handled or had access to evidence during an investigation. Explanation. Option A highlights the primary purpose of the chain of custody in evidence management, which is to establish a documented trail of custody for evidence from its initial collection to its presentation in court. Maintaining an accurate and complete chain of custody is crucial for ensuring the admissibility and reliability of evidence in legal proceedings, as it demonstrates the integrity and authenticity of the evidence by documenting who had possession of it at each stage of the investigation. This helps preserve the evidentiary value of items and guards against tampering, contamination, or loss, thereby upholding the principles of fairness and justice in the criminal justice system. Question 11. Which of the following scenarios illustrates a violation of an individual's Fourth Amendment rights under the South Dakota Constitution? A. A law enforcement officer conducts a warrantless search of a suspect's vehicle based solely on their race or ethnicity. B. An officer obtains a search warrant from a judge based on reliable information provided by an anonymous tipster. C. During a routine traffic stop, an officer asks the driver for consent to search the vehicle, and the driver voluntarily agrees. D. Police officers conduct a search of a private residence without a warrant but with the verbal consent of the homeowner. Correct answer. A. A law enforcement officer conducts a warrantless search of a suspect's vehicle based solely on their race or ethnicity. Explanation. Option A represents a violation of an individual's Fourth Amendment rights under the South Dakota Constitution, which prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. Conducting a search based solely on race or ethnicity constitutes racial profiling and lacks a valid legal justification, thus violating the constitutional rights of the individual. Such actions undermine the principles of equal protection under the law and erode trust between law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve. Question 12. In South Dakota, what is the purpose of the Law Enforcement Office's Bill of Rights? A. To provide preferential treatment and immunity from prosecution for law enforcement officers accused of misconduct. B. To establish procedural safeguards and due process rights for law enforcement officers involved in disciplinary proceedings. C. To limit the accountability and oversight mechanisms applicable to law enforcement agencies and officers. D. To grant law enforcement officers unrestricted authority to exercise discretion and use force in the performance of their duties. Correct answer. B. To establish procedural safeguards and due process rights for law enforcement officers involved in disciplinary proceedings. Explanation. Option B accurately describes the purpose of the Law Enforcement Office's Bill of Rights, which aims to ensure that law enforcement officers receive fair treatment and due process when facing disciplinary actions or allegations of misconduct. The bill outlines specific procedural protections, such as the right to legal representation, the right to a hearing before disciplinary action is taken, and limitations on interrogation tactics during internal investigations. These safeguards help safeguard the rights of officers while promoting accountability and maintaining public trust in law enforcement. Question 13. Which of the following best defines the concept of probable cause in the context of law enforcement actions in South Dakota? A. A reasonable suspicion that an individual has committed or is about to commit a crime, based on specific and articulable facts. B. Concrete evidence proving beyond a reasonable doubt that a suspect is guilty of a criminal offense. C. Any information provided by an anonymous source indicating potential criminal activity. D. A hunch or gut feeling on the part of law enforcement officers regarding a person's involvement in criminal behavior. Correct answer. A. A reasonable suspicion that an individual has committed or is about to commit a crime, based on specific and articulable facts. Explanation. Option A accurately defines probable cause as the legal standard required for law enforcement officers to conduct certain actions, such as obtaining a search warrant or making an arrest. Probable cause exists when there are specific and articulable facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe that a crime has been, is being, or will be committed. This standard falls between mere suspicion and proof beyond a reasonable doubt and serves as a critical safeguard against unwarranted intrusions into individual privacy and liberty. Question 14. Which South Dakota specific law regulates the process of issuing and executing search warrants by law enforcement officers? A. The South Dakota Uniform Controlled Substances Act. B. The South Dakota Wiretapping and Electronic Surveillance Control Act. C. The South Dakota Codified Laws Title 23A, Chapter 35. D. The South Dakota Open Meetings Act. Correct answer: C. The South Dakota Codified Laws Title 23A, Chapter 35. Explanation: Option C correctly identifies the relevant statutory framework governing search warrants in South Dakota. Title 23A, Chapter 35 of the South Dakota Codified Laws outlines the procedures and requirements for obtaining, issuing, and executing search warrants by law enforcement officers. This chapter establishes the legal standards, criteria, and safeguards applicable to the search warrant process, ensuring compliance with constitutional principles and protecting the rights of individuals against unreasonable searches and seizures. Question 15. Which of the following statements best reflects the role of a law enforcement officer in upholding the principles of procedural justice? A. Officers prioritize swift and harsh punishment for offenders to deter future criminal behavior. B. Officers treat all individuals with fairness, dignity, and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. C. Officers use coercive tactics and intimidation to compel compliance with legal directives. D. Officers focus solely on enforcing the law without considering the underlying causes of crime or social context. Correct answer: B. Officers treat all individuals with fairness, dignity, and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. Explanation: Option B aligns with the principles of procedural justice, which emphasize the importance of fairness, neutrality, and respect in law enforcement interactions. Upholding procedural justice involves treating all individuals with dignity and respect, listening to their concerns, providing explanations for actions taken, and ensuring that decisions are transparent and unbiased. By fostering positive relationships and trust through respectful and equitable treatment, law enforcement officers can enhance legitimacy and cooperation within the communities they serve, contributing to safer and more inclusive environments. Question 16. Which South Dakota specific statute governs the procedures for obtaining and maintaining records of criminal history information? A. The South Dakota Juvenile Justice Code. B. The South Dakota Criminal Records Act. C. The South Dakota Uniform Law Enforcement Reporting Manual. D. The South Dakota Division of Criminal Investigation Act. Correct answer: D. The South Dakota Division of Criminal Investigation Act. Explanation: Option D identifies the relevant statute that governs the procedures for obtaining and maintaining records of criminal history information in South Dakota. The South Dakota Division of Criminal Investigation Act establishes the authority and responsibilities of the Division of Criminal Investigation, DCI, in maintaining criminal justice information systems, including databases of criminal records, fingerprints, and other related information. This statute ensures the secure and accurate management of criminal history data while safeguarding individual privacy rights and complying with applicable laws and regulations. Question 17. Which of the following statements accurately reflects the concept of qualified immunity as it applies to law enforcement officers in South Dakota? A. Qualified immunity shields law enforcement officers from liability for civil damages in lawsuits alleging violations of individuals' constitutional rights, unless their conduct violates clearly established law. B. Qualified immunity provides law enforcement officers with absolute immunity from civil and criminal liability for any actions taken within the scope of their official duties. C. Qualified immunity allows law enforcement officers to use any means necessary to enforce the law without fear of legal consequences. D. Qualified immunity applies only to certain categories of law enforcement officers, such as federal agents or officers serving in specialized units. Correct answer: A. Qualified immunity shields law enforcement officers from liability for civil damages in lawsuits alleging violations of individuals' constitutional rights, unless their conduct violates clearly established law. Explanation: Option A accurately describes the concept of qualified immunity as it applies to law enforcement officers in South Dakota and across the United States. Qualified immunity protects government officials, including law enforcement officers, from civil liability for damages unless their conduct violates clearly established constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. This legal doctrine aims to balance the need for accountability with the recognition of the challenging and often split-second decisions faced by law enforcement officers in the performance of their duties. However, it does not grant absolute immunity and may be overcome if the officer's actions are deemed unconstitutional based on existing legal precedent. Question 18. Which of the following scenarios best illustrates the application of the exigent circumstances exception to the warrant requirement under South Dakota law? A. A law enforcement officer obtains a search warrant from a judge based on probable cause before conducting a search of a suspect's residence. B. During a domestic violence incident, officers enter a residence without a warrant to prevent imminent harm to the occupants. C. Officers conduct a search of a suspect's vehicle based solely on their race or ethnicity without obtaining a warrant. D. Law enforcement officers conduct a search of a suspect's property after receiving an anonymous tip about potential criminal activity. Correct answer: B. During a domestic violence incident, officers enter a residence without a warrant to prevent imminent harm to the occupants. Explanation: Option B exemplifies the application of the exigent circumstances exception to the warrant requirement under South Dakota law. Exigent circumstances refer to urgent situations that require immediate action to prevent serious harm or injury, protect life or property, or prevent the destruction of evidence. In cases involving domestic violence or other emergencies where there is an immediate threat to safety, law enforcement officers may enter a residence without a warrant to address the imminent danger and ensure the well-being of individuals involved. This exception allows officers to take prompt and necessary action in critical situations where obtaining a warrant would be impractical or jeopardize public safety. Question 19. In South Dakota, what legal standard must law enforcement officers adhere to when conducting a Terry stop and frisk? A. Reasonable suspicion that the individual has committed a crime. B. Probable cause to believe the individual is armed and dangerous. C. Clear and convincing evidence of criminal activity. D. Absolute certainty of the individual's guilt. Correct answer: A. Reasonable suspicion that the individual has committed a crime. Explanation: Option A reflects the legal standard required for conducting a Terry stop and frisk, as established by the U.S. Supreme Court in Terry v. Ohio. Law enforcement officers must have reasonable suspicion that the individual is engaged in criminal activity, based on specific and articulable facts, to justify a brief investigatory stop and pat-down search for weapons. This standard is lower than probable cause but requires more than a mere hunch or speculation. It allows officers to take limited action to ensure their safety and the safety of others without violating the individual's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. Question 20. Which South Dakota specific law governs the licensing and regulation of private security personnel and agencies? A. The South Dakota Private Security Act. B. The South Dakota Private Investigator Licensing Act. C. The South Dakota Security Services Regulation Act. D. The South Dakota Security Guard Registration Act. Correct answer: A. The South Dakota Private Security Act. Explanation: Option A identifies the relevant statute that regulates the licensing and oversight of private security personnel and agencies in South Dakota. The South Dakota Private Security Act establishes requirements and standards for individuals and businesses engaged in providing security services to the public, including provisions related to licensure, training, background checks, and operational practices. This law aims to ensure the professionalism, competency, and accountability of the private security industry while safeguarding the interests of clients and the public. Question 21. Which of the following best defines the concept of community-oriented policing as practiced in South Dakota? A law enforcement approach focused on aggressive crime suppression tactics and rapid response to emergency calls. B. A collaborative strategy that involves partnering with community members to address underlying causes of crime and enhance public safety. C. An enforcement model that prioritizes punitive measures and strict adherence to laws and regulations. D. A centralized policing system that relies on technological surveillance and data analysis to monitor and control criminal activity. Correct answer: B. A collaborative strategy that involves partnering with community members to address underlying causes of crime and enhance public safety. Explanation: Option B accurately describes community-oriented policing, which emphasizes building partnerships and collaborative relationships between law enforcement agencies and community members to address crime and disorder. This approach involves identifying and addressing the root causes of crime through problem-solving efforts, engaging residents in decision-making processes, and promoting trust, transparency, and accountability. Community-oriented policing recognizes that effective crime prevention and public safety require the active involvement and support of the community, making it a cornerstone of modern policing practices in South Dakota and elsewhere. Question 22. Which South Dakota-specific statute outlines the procedures and requirements for obtaining and renewing a concealed carry permit? A. The South Dakota Firearm Safety and Training Act. B. The South Dakota Concealed Weapons Permit Act. C. The South Dakota Firearms Licensing and Regulation Act. D. The South Dakota Firearms Training and Certification Act. Correct answer: B. The South Dakota Concealed Weapons Permit Act. Explanation: Option B correctly identifies the statute governing the issuance and renewal of concealed carry permits in South Dakota. The South Dakota Concealed Weapons Permit Act establishes the legal framework for obtaining authorization to carry concealed firearms for self-defense purposes. This law sets forth eligibility criteria, training requirements, application procedures, and renewal processes for individuals seeking to obtain or maintain a concealed carry permit in compliance with state law. Understanding this statute is essential for law enforcement officers responsible for enforcing firearm regulations and interacting with individuals carrying concealed weapons. Question 23. In South Dakota, what is the primary purpose of the Law Enforcement Training Fund? A. To provide financial assistance to law enforcement agencies for purchasing equipment and vehicles. B. To support ongoing training and professional development programs for law enforcement officers. C. To fund community policing initiatives and crime prevention programs. D. To compensate victims of crime for their losses and expenses. Correct answer: B. To support ongoing training and professional development programs for law enforcement officers. Explanation: Option B reflects the primary purpose of the Law Enforcement Training Fund in South Dakota, which is to support training and professional development opportunities for law enforcement officers. The fund helps finance various training initiatives, including basic recruit training academies, advanced skills courses, specialized training programs, and continuing education opportunities for active duty officers. By investing in training and development, the fund aims to enhance the knowledge, skills, and capabilities of law enforcement personnel, thereby promoting effectiveness, professionalism, and accountability within the law enforcement community. Question 24. Which South Dakota-specific law addresses the issuance and enforcement of protection orders in cases involving domestic violence or stalking? A. The South Dakota Domestic Abuse Act. B. The South Dakota Protection Order Enforcement Act. C. The South Dakota Family Violence Prevention Act. D. The South Dakota Stalking Prevention and Victim Protection Act. Correct answer: A. The South Dakota Domestic Abuse Act. Explanation: Option A identifies the relevant statute that governs the issuance and enforcement of protection orders in cases of domestic violence or stalking in South Dakota. The South Dakota Domestic Abuse Act provides legal mechanisms for victims of domestic violence to obtain protection orders, also known as restraining orders, against perpetrators to ensure their safety and well-being. These orders may include provisions for prohibiting contact, imposing stay-away requirements, and granting temporary custody or support arrangements. The Act aims to empower victims, prevent further harm, and hold perpetrators accountable for their actions. Question 25. Which of the following principles guides law enforcement officers in conducting effective community policing initiatives in South Dakota? A. Proactive enforcement strategies aimed at maximizing arrest and citation rates. B. Responsive approaches that prioritize rapid response to emergency calls and critical incidents. C. Collaborative problem-solving efforts that engage community members in identifying and addressing local concerns. D. Isolationist tactics focused on maintaining strict separation between law enforcement and the community. Correct answer: C. Collaborative problem-solving efforts that engage community members in identifying and addressing local concerns. Explanation: Option C reflects the guiding principle of community policing in South Dakota, emphasizing collaborative problem-solving efforts that involve partnership and engagement with community members. Effective community policing initiatives rely on building trust, fostering open communication, and working together to identify and address the underlying causes of crime and disorder. By actively involving residents, businesses, organizations, and other stakeholders in problem-solving processes, law enforcement officers can develop tailored strategies and interventions that reflect community priorities, values, and resources, ultimately enhancing public safety and quality of life. Question 26. Which South Dakota specific law addresses the procedures and requirements for obtaining a permit to carry a concealed pistol or revolver? A. The South Dakota Firearm Safety and Regulation Act. B. The South Dakota Concealed Pistol Permit Act. C. The South Dakota Firearms and Ammunition Control Act. D. The South Dakota Firearms Safety Training Act. Correct answer: B. The South Dakota Concealed Pistol Permit Act. Explanation: Option B correctly identifies the statute governing the issuance of concealed pistol permits in South Dakota. The Concealed Pistol Permit Act outlines the eligibility criteria, application process, and training requirements for individuals seeking authorization to carry concealed firearms for personal protection. Compliance with this law is essential for law enforcement officers responsible for enforcing firearm regulations and interacting with individuals carrying concealed weapons. Question 27. In South Dakota, what is the primary purpose of the Law Enforcement Officers Standards and Training (LEOST) Commission? A. To oversee the accreditation process for law enforcement agencies in the state. B. To establish and enforce ethical standards and conduct guidelines for law enforcement officers. C. To administer and regulate the licensing and certification of law enforcement officers. D. To provide training and professional development opportunities for law enforcement personnel. Correct answer: C. To administer and regulate the licensing and certification of law enforcement officers. Explanation: Option C reflects the primary responsibility of the Law Enforcement Officers Standards and Training (LEOST) Commission in South Dakota. The Commission is tasked with administering and regulating the licensing, certification, and ongoing professional development of law enforcement officers in the state. By setting standards for recruitment, training, and conduct, the Commission aims to ensure that law enforcement personnel meet the highest professional and ethical standards, thereby enhancing public trust and confidence in law enforcement agencies. Question 28. Which South Dakota specific law establishes guidelines for the use of deadly force by law enforcement officers? A. The South Dakota Justifiable Homicide by Law Enforcement Act. B. The South Dakota Use of Force Continuum Act. C. The South Dakota Law Enforcement Office's Bill of Rights. D. The South Dakota Police Accountability and Transparency Act. Correct answer: A. The South Dakota Justifiable Homicide by Law Enforcement Act. Explanation: Option A identifies the relevant statute governing the use of deadly force by law enforcement officers in South Dakota. The Justifiable Homicide by Law Enforcement Act establishes guidelines and standards for when deadly force may be lawfully used by officers in the performance of their duties. Understanding this law is crucial for officers to make informed decisions regarding the use of force and to ensure compliance with state statutes and departmental policies. Question 29. Which South Dakota specific law regulates the procedures and requirements for obtaining and renewing a permit for the purchase of handguns? A. The South Dakota Firearms Safety and Regulation Act. B. The South Dakota Handgun Permitting and Registration Act. C. The South Dakota Firearms Purchase Permit Act. D. The South Dakota Firearms Transaction Record Act. Correct answer: C. The South Dakota Firearms Purchase Permit Act. Explanation: Option C correctly identifies the statute governing the issuance of permits for the purchase of handguns in South Dakota. The Firearms Purchase Permit Act establishes procedures and criteria for individuals seeking authorization to purchase handguns from licensed firearms dealers. This law may include background checks, waiting periods, and other requirements to ensure the lawful transfer and ownership of firearms while promoting public safety and preventing firearms-related crimes. Question 30. Under South Dakota law, what is the primary purpose of Miranda rights during police interrogations? A. To inform suspects of their right to an attorney. B. To inform suspects of their right to remain silent. C. To inform suspects of the charges against them. D. To inform suspects of potential consequences. Correct answer: B. To inform suspects of their right to remain silent. Explanation: Miranda rights, established by the U.S. Supreme Court case Miranda v. Arizona, ensure that suspects are aware of their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. When a suspect is taken into custody or is under interrogation, the police must inform them of their right to remain silent and that anything they say can be used against them in court. This is to safeguard against coerced confessions and to ensure that suspects are aware of their constitutional rights.